She unclasped it standing at the counter of Mercer's Pawn and Trade on Galveston Avenue, and she did not let herself look down at her own hands while she did it, because she already knew that if she looked down she would not finish. She kept her eyes on a man behind the glass case, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a gray mustache and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and she unclasped the necklace and set on the glass, and she did not say anything for a moment, and neither did he. The chain was thin gold, 14 karat, and the locket attached to it was no larger than a thumbnail, worn smooth on one side from 20 years of being pressed between a woman's palm and her collarbone whenever she was nervous or tired or needed to feel something solid. The man picked it up with 2 fingers and turned it over under the light above the case. He did not say anything about the locket. He quoted her a number. She said yes before he finished the sentence, because she had already done the math 4 times in the last 3 days, and she already knew the number she needed and the number he was going to give her, and she already knew they were not the same number, and she already knew that the difference was going to come out of her own checking account, and that her checking account was going to be sitting at $11.40 by the time she was done. She needed $2,400. She had, between the pawn shop money and what she could pull from her account without bouncing her upcoming electric bill, $2,388.60. She was going to be short. She already knew she was going to be short. She had already decided it did not matter. The money was not for her rent. It was not for her son Gideon's school supplies or his winter coat or the copay on the inhaler he needed refilled. It was for the man in apartment 4, whose name she knew as Dale Morrow, who was $2,400 behind on his rent as of that morning, and whose landlord had told him, loudly enough for half the second floor to hear through walls, that he had until 5 o'clock that afternoon before the locks got changed. She had spoken to Dale Morrow maybe 14 times in the 4 months he had lived in apartment 4. Enough times to know he took his coffee in a paper cup and walked to the end of the block every morning to drink it. Enough times to know he held the front door for her without being asked and returned Gideon's basketball the one time it rolled down the hall and wedged under his door. Enough times to know he was quiet and polite and kept his eyes down in a way that suggested he was a man who had decided for some reason to take up as little space as possible in the world. She had spoken to him 14 times. She had never once been inside his apartment. She had no real reason to give away the last valuable thing she owned for a man she knew that moderately well, except that she had stood in her own kitchen at 2 a.m. and done the math and looked at the alternative, which was that a person who had done nothing wrong to anyone she could see was going to be locked out of his home in the morning, and she could not make that sit right inside her chest no matter how she arranged it. She herself was 3 weeks from coming up short on her own rent. The necklace was the last thing. It had been her mother's, and then it had been hers, and she had carried it for 20 years, and she had nearly sold it 4 separate times before this, and pulled back each time at the last second. And this time she put on the counter, and said yes to the number, and took the money, and left before she could change her mind. She did not hand him the cash directly. She put it in a plain white envelope. Every bill she had taken from the pawn shop, plus the rest pulled from the ATM on the corner, $2,400 exactly, every cent of it. No note, nothing written on the outside of the envelope. She walked up the stairs of the Fenwick Arms apartments on Crestline Drive in Fort Worth, Texas at 3:40 in the afternoon, and she slid that envelope under the door of apartment 4, and she knocked twice with the flat of her knuckles, and she turned and walked back down the hall to her own apartment and closed her door behind her and stood with her back against it and breathed. 3 days passed. He did not knock on her door. He did not slip a note under hers. He said nothing in the hallway, and on the 2nd day she began to wonder if he'd even found the envelope, and on the 3rd day his apartment was empty, his beat-up Pontiac gone from the lot, and the landlord mentioned it almost as an aside, that apartment 4 had been vacated, paid in full, no forwarding address. She stood in the hallway outside his door for a moment, looking at the number on it, and she thought about her mother's necklace, sitting in a glass case at Mercer's Pawn and Trade, and she went back inside her own apartment and started dinner. And what that man did 1 week later was the one thing nobody in that building, least of all her, saw coming. But before she tells you what happened next, if you have ever given away something you could not actually afford to give, just because somebody needed it more than you needed to be okay that month, then hit that subscribe button right now, because that is exactly who this channel is built for. Go on. She will wait. Then let her back all the way up Because to understand why she gave away the last thing she owned to a man she barely knew, you have to understand exactly what kind of year it had been, and exactly what kind of man he had let her believe he was. Her name was Patrice Hollen. She was 41 years old, and she worked the early shift at a commercial laundry facility called Sunbright Industrial Linen on the east side of Fort Worth, a low-grade building that smelled of hot water and bleach and steam from the moment you pulled into the parking lot. She had worked there for 6 years. She ran the flatwork ironer on the primary line, which meant she fed sheets and tablecloths and napkins from a rolling cart through a machine the size of a small truck that pressed them flat and folded them and sent them out the other side. And she did this for 6.5 hours a day, 5 days a week, standing on a rubber mat in front of a machine that ran at 230 degrees and filled the air around her with damp heat that never fully went away even in winter. Her feet hurt every evening. She stopped noticing that they hurt after the first year. She made $17.40 an hour, which came out after taxes and a small deduction for her health insurance, to roughly $2,200 a month. Her rent at the Fenwick Arms was $870 a month for a 2-bedroom unit on the second floor, Unit 6, which she had lived in for 4 years. The building was a 3-story brick structure built in 1961, the kind of building that had been many things over many decades and settled into being slightly worn and slightly loud and held together by a landlord named Gerald Fisk, who lived in Unit 1 on the ground floor and who fixed things when pushed and who was louder than he was mean. The hallways smelled of a particular combination of old carpet and other people's cooking that apartment buildings of a certain age develop and never lose. The elevator had been out of service for 11 months. The windows in Patrice's unit faced west, which meant the afternoon sun came to them hard in summer, and she kept the blinds down from noon until 6 from May through September. She knew which floorboards creaked and which drawer in the kitchen stuck in humidity, and which burner on the stove took 3 clicks of the igniter to catch. She had lived there long enough that it was home. She had made it home deliberately and with care, the way a person does when they understand that dignity does not require a better address. Only a made bed and a clean floor and something that smells like food when your child comes through the door. Her son Gideon was 9 years old. He was in the 4th grade at Crockett Elementary on Hemphill Street, 11 minutes from the Fenwick Arms if Patrice drove and 23 minutes if they walked, and they walked on mornings when she was not running late, which was maybe twice a week. Gideon was a serious child in the way that some children are serious. The kind of kid who asked questions that adults needed a full beat to answer, and who kept a notebook with a green cover in which he wrote down things he wanted to look up later, things he had overheard or read, or noticed that he did not yet have words for. He was thin and brown-haired and wore glasses that he was forever pushing up his nose, and he could tell you the starting lineup of the Texas Rangers going back to 2015, but could not always remember to put his shoes away. Patrice loved him with the specific and uncomplicated fullness that a person who has made sacrifices for someone else loves them, which is to say she loved him so completely that it sometimes caught her off guard, a wave that arrived in quiet moments, while she was packing his lunch or watching him sleep or listening to him explain something to the cat in the apartment above theirs. There was no father in the picture, or rather there was a father in the technical sense, a man named Royce who had left Fort Worth when Gideon was 14 months old for reasons that were never entirely clear to Patrice and eventually stopped mattering, because a person who leaves that cleanly and that silently has already told you everything about themselves they are ever going to tell you. She had not heard from Royce in 7 years. She had stopped expecting to. After rent and utilities and the inhaler prescription and groceries and Gideon's school lunch account and the internet bill that she refused to cut because Gideon needed for school, she had, in a typical month, somewhere between $200 and $300 left over. This was her buffer. When something went wrong, it came out of the buffer. And when the buffer ran out, something got paid late. And when something got paid late, Gerald Fisk left a note under her door in his cramped handwriting on a piece of yellow legal paper. And she paid it as soon as she had it. She and Gerald had an understanding. He was the landlord, not her enemy. She understood the difference. She had one credit card with a $1,200 limit that she kept for genuine emergencies and tried not to touch. She had a savings account with a balance that hovered somewhere between $40 and $200 depending on the month. She had a 2009 Honda Civic with 162,000 miles on it that she maintained as carefully as she could afford to, which meant she watched the oil in the tires and said a private prayer when it started in cold weather. She was not bitter about any of this. That is the thing about Patrice Hollen. That mattered. She was not performing resilience, and she was not grinding her teeth through misery, and she was not secretly ashamed of her address or her paycheck or her rubber mat on the Irona line. She had built a real life on what she had. It was a small life in the way that lives measured from the outside look small when the measuring tool is money. From the inside, it was full enough. She had Gideon. She had a window that caught the evening light at a particular angle in October that she had never once gotten tired of looking at. She had 2 women she worked with, Donna Rash and Seal Morales, whose company she genuinely enjoyed over coffee in the break room at Sunbright. She had her routine, which was not glamorous and was not meaningless, and she had her one quiet rule, the rule she had made for herself sometime in the middle of the hardest year of her life, the year Royce left and Gideon was still in diapers, and she was so far underwater financially that she could not see the surface from where she was. A year in which a woman she barely knew named Thelma First, who lived across the hall, had appeared one evening with a bag of groceries and set them on Patrice's counter without being asked and without saying much about it. Thelma First had been gone from the Fenwick Arms for 3 years now, moved to Abilene to be closer to her daughter. Patrice still thought about her. Not often, but at the right moments. The rule Patrice had made for herself in the wake of that bag of groceries was simple, and she had never written down because she did not need to. She did not ask anyone for anything, and she did not let anyone go without, if she had any way at all to prevent it, even a small one, even one that cost her something she could not easily replace. That rule is where this entire story lives. Dale Morrow moved into apartment 4 on a Tuesday evening in early June with 2 large duffel bags and a cardboard box and a sleeping bag rolled under one arm, which Patrice noticed because she happened to be coming up the stairs at the same time he was going up them, and she held the fire door at the top of the second-floor landing because her hands were full of groceries. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Sure." He went to his door, and she went to hers, and that was the whole of their first interaction. She saw him again 4 days later at the mailboxes in the front lobby. He was in a gray jacket that had been washed enough times to go soft at the elbows, jeans that were clean but worn at the knees, work boots that had seen considerable use. He was roughly her height, maybe an inch taller, with dark brown hair going gray at the temples, a lean face with a few days of stubble, and a particular quality of stillness that some people carry in their bodies when they have learned to be careful about how much of themselves they take up in shared spaces. He looked like a man who had been working outdoors for most of his adult life, and had recently stopped. That was the impression she had. She could not have said exactly why. She got her mail. He got his. He said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning." She noticed his mail was a single white envelope with no return address, which she did not think about again. Over the following week, she built up the small catalog of knowledge that you build about a neighbor in a building with thin walls and shared hallways, knowledge that is intimate in the way of proximity rather than the way of connection. She knew he got up early, somewhere around 5 in the morning, because she heard his floor creak above the kitchen of the unit below his. She knew he cooked simple things that did not require much time or equipment, because the smells that came to the shared ventilation were plain, rice and eggs, and occasionally something with onion. She knew he had no television, or if he had one, he never turned it on, because she had never once heard it through the wall they shared on the south side. He had a phone, because she had heard him speak on it twice in the hallway, brief monosyllabic conversations that told her nothing. He received no visitors. No one in the building seemed to know him well, which was not unusual at the Fenwick Arms, where people came and went with regularity, and where Gerald Fisk ran a tight enough operation that the turnover was constant without being chaotic. She learned his name from Gerald, who had mentioned it in passing when Patrice had asked, only out of the general curiosity one has about a new neighbor who moved in across from the Bellows family. Gerald had said, "Fellow named Dale Morrow, keeps to himself, paid first and last up front in cash." That last detail had registered, and then slipped away, because some people preferred cash, and it meant nothing by itself. Dale Morrow held the door for her every time their paths crossed in the lobby. He returned Gideon's basketball, without making it into a conversation. He moved his car in the parking lot the one time she needed the spot nearest the door, because she was bringing in groceries in a bad heat, and he had parked in it by accident. These were small things, unremarkable things, the ordinary currency of decent neighbors everywhere. what she noticed about him, what stayed with her later when she tried to understand why she had done what she did, was not any one thing. It was the accumulation of them, the consistency. A person who is reliably, quietly decent to you over months occupies a different place in your understanding of them than a person who is decent once. She had come to trust him in the way you trust a neighbor you have never tested. She did not know she trusted him until the week the trouble started. The laundry on Gideon's bedroom floor that had been waiting to be done all week. Dinner that needed to be started before 7 or would not be finished before 8:30, and Gideon would be in bed without enough sleep. The last load of whites going into machine in the building's basement laundry room. The one working wash of the two, because the second had been out of service for 2 months and Gerald had said he was getting to it. These were the ordinary materials of a Tuesday evening in late September, when Patrice came up the stairs from the basement and heard the conversation in the second-floor hallway. She heard it before she came through the fire door. Gerald Fisk's voice first, louder than the situation seemed to require, and in a quieter voice she recognized as Dale's. And the quality of the exchange was wrong in the way of conversation that is not really an exchange at all, one person talking and the other receiving it. She came to the fire door, and Gerald was standing outside the door to apartment 4 with a piece of paper in his hand, and Dale was standing in his own doorway, one hand on the frame, and the expression on his face was the one that stopped her. She had expected, if there was trouble with the man in apartment 4, to see something that looked like shame or fear or the particular desperation of a person in financial difficulty. She had seen both of those faces in this building before. She had worn them herself once. What was on Dale Morrow's face was something else. It was the face of a man who was hearing something he had been expecting to hear for a while and had arrived at a place somewhere past the arguing about it. It was a face that said, "I know." It was a face that said, "This is where this was always going." That face frightened her more than the arguing would have. It was too calm. It was the calm of someone who has decided not to fight something they are fully capable of fighting. Gerald told him 5 o'clock Thursday. He told him that was it. That was the limit. That he had carried the account 2 months, and he was not a charity, and the building had a waiting list, and he had been patient, but patience had a number. He told him $2,400 by 5 o'clock Thursday, or the locks were getting changed Thursday evening, and his belongings would be boxed and held for 30 days. Dale said, "I understand." Gerald said, "I am sorry." "Dale, I am." He sounded like he meant it, which was the most accurate thing about Gerald Fisk, that he was a hard man in business and a soft man about being hard. He handed him the paper, which was a notice in writing, and he went back down the stairs. Dale looked at the paper for a moment. Then he looked up and saw Patrice standing at the end of the hall by the fire door with her laundry basket, and he looked at her the way a person looks at someone they did not know was there, the particular exposure of it, and he said, "Sorry you had to hear that." He went inside and closed his door. She stood in the hall for a full 30 seconds without moving. That night, after Gideon was in bed, she sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen, and she wrote down numbers. She did not need to write them down because she already knew them, but she wrote them down because writing them down made her feel like she was doing something concrete rather than circling around a decision she had already made and was not quite ready to admit she had made. She wrote her checking account balance. She wrote her upcoming bills and their due dates. She wrote the number 2,400 because she needed to look at it. She sat with that number for a long time. She thought about the face he had made, not frightened, not arguing. Past it. She thought about the 2 duffel bags and the cardboard box and the sleeping bag rolled under his arm the first night she saw him, which was not the inventory of a man who had much to fall back on. She thought about Thelma's first bag of groceries on her kitchen counter. The particular weight of it, not just the physical weight, but the other weight, the one that sat in her chest for days afterward, the weight of being seen in the middle of a bad stretch by someone who asked for nothing in return. She thought about a night 11 years ago when she and Gideon's father were 6 weeks from eviction in an apartment in Dallas, and she had not slept more than 4 hours in 3 days from the anxiety of it, and she had looked at her son in his bouncy seat and understood in a way that dropped straight through her that she would do anything at all, to keep a roof over that child's head, and that she had done it. She had found a way, and the finding of the way had involved a loan from A, cousin she barely knew, and a paycheck advance from a job she had been at for 3 weeks, and a temporary roommate situation that was deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved and had lasted for months but had worked. She had not thought about that apartment in Dallas for years. She thought about it now. She looked at the numbers on the piece of paper. She thought about a man going somewhere without a roof because she had the means to prevent it and chose not to use them. She already knew which way she was going to go. She had known since the hallway. She just needed to sit with the numbers long enough to be able to tell herself she had thought it through. The necklace. She knew before she started writing the numbers that it was going to come down to the necklace. There was nothing else. She had already sold the small diamond stud earrings she had bought herself 5 years ago after a Christmas bonus. She had already sold the tablet she'd been given by her sister-in-law the previous Christmas because Gideon had one through his school and she never used it. She had a small collection of paperback novels she had read 4 times each and would not sell because they were paperbacks and she was not that desperate, and she would not sell anything that was Gideon's. And the necklace was the last thing of any value she owned that was not a necessity. It was her mother's. That sentence contains everything. Her mother's name had been Wanda Hollen, née Bragg, and she had died of a stroke in 2009 when Patrice was 26 and Gideon was not yet born, which meant Gideon had never met the woman whose laugh Patrice could still hear exactly in her head if she needed to, clear as a recording, loud and unguarded, the laugh of a woman who was not performing anything for anyone. The necklace had been on her mother's throat when she died, and it had been given to Patrice by her aunt at the funeral, placed in her hand in a small velvet pouch, and Patrice had put it on in the parking lot of the funeral home and had not taken off for 11 years. She had taken off eventually, for sleeping and for work, for the Ironer at Sunbright where jewelry was not permitted near the equipment. But she had put it back on every morning for 11 years in the way of a ritual that had nothing to do with the piece of metal itself and everything to do with what it held. The chain was 14 karat, thin as a thread, the kind of chain that developed a habit of knotting if you let it coil on itself in a jewelry dish. The locket was the size of a thumbnail, oval, plain gold on one side, and worn absolutely smooth from the years of being pressed between her palm and her collarbone, which she did when she was anxious, which was a habit she had not even known she had until a co-worker at Sunbright pointed out one day. Inside the locket was a photograph, cut to fit the oval, a small square-color photograph showing her mother standing in front of a fence in somebody's yard in strong sunlight, smiling at whoever was holding the camera, the smile not posed, not ready, just real. Patrice could not have said how many times she had opened that locket to look at that photograph over the course of 20 years, but the number was very large. She had almost sold it in the Dallas apartment. She had almost sold it the year Gideon needed $260 worth of dental work, and the insurance would not cover it. She had almost sold it the year her Civic needed new rotors, and she could not get to work without the car. Each time she had gotten to the counter of whatever pawn shop or gold buyer she was standing in front of, and she had taken from around her neck and felt the specific cold of the air on the skin of her throat where the chain had been lying, and she had put it back on, not because she could not face the pragmatics, because she could not, in the final moment, do that to her mother, not for rotors, not for dental work, not for herself. This was for someone else's roof. She sat at the kitchen table until 11:30 that night, and then she went to bed and lay with the ceiling for an hour, and then she slept and she woke at 5:15 and got Gideon's breakfast ready and walked him to school and came back and changed out her work clothes because she had a rare day off, and she sat for another 20 minutes with her coffee, and then she got her coat and her purse, and she left the Fenwick Arms and drove her Civic to Mercer's Pawn and Trade on Galveston Avenue. She had chosen Mercer's specifically, not the place on University Drive, not the gold and silver exchange on Camp Bowie, Mercer's, because she had been past it 100 times, and it looked like the kind of place where a person behind the counter would not make her feel worse about what she was doing than she already felt. That logic may seem thin, but it was a logic available to her at the time, and she worked with it. The man behind the counter was named Earl. She learned later, though she did not ask his name that morning. He had a mustache and the flannel shirt and the rolled sleeves and the quality of a man who had seen everything that could be brought through a pawn shop door and felt no need to editorialize about any of it. He took the necklace. He turned it under the light. He quoted her $640, which he said was for the gold value of the chain since the locket was not gem set and had no additional melt value. She said yes. He counted out the bills. She put them in her wallet and drove to the ATM on Weatherford Street and withdrew the remaining cash she needed and went home and counted it all out on the kitchen table and put it in a plain white envelope and did not write anything on it. She climbed the stairs of the Fenwick Arms at 3:40 in the afternoon on Thursday, which was the same afternoon the locks were scheduled to be changed at 5 o'clock. She walked down the second-floor hallway to apartment 4. She crouched down and slid the envelope under the door with 2 fingers, pushing it all the way through so no corner of it was visible from the hall side. She stood up and knocked twice with her knuckles. 2 solid knocks, not tentative. She did not want them to sound tentative. She wanted them to sound like something certain that had happened and was now done. She turned and walked back down the hallway to her apartment before the sound of movement she heard from inside apartment 4 reached the door. She went inside. She locked her own door. She stood with her back against it. The skin of her throat where the chain had been was cold. She stood there until the cold faded, and then she put a pot on the stove for Gideon's dinner. She had expected. She realized later that it would feel like relief. It felt like nothing, or it felt like something she did not have a name for, something quiet and permanent in the way of a door that has been closed from the inside. Not regret. Regret was the wrong word. It was not even grief exactly, though it was in the same family. It was a feeling of having done the last version of a particular thing that you were ever going to do, of a chapter of your relationship to an object being over, because the object was gone, and the specific way of the chapter maturing, regardless of whether the ending was right or wrong. She thought, before she slept that night, that she would feel better in the morning. She mostly did. She did not think about the necklace with the first coffee. She thought about it when she was making Gideon's lunch and needed something to do with her hands. She touched the skin of her throat the way she had always touched the chain when she was standing at the counter, and she found the chain was not there, and that was when the full specific size of the absence arrived in her chest. She went to work. She came home. She made dinner. Gideon told her about a book he was reading. She listened. She was almost completely present while she listened, which was the best she could manage that day. She did not hear from Dale Morrow. She had not expected to hear from him quickly. But as the first day passed, and then the evening, and she heard nothing, no knock, no note, she began to wonder if it found the envelope at all. Had she pushed it far enough? What if it had slid behind the radiator under his door? She did not let herself think about this for long, because the thought loop it created was not useful, and she had made her peace with the decision, or she was making her peace with it, and worrying about logistics did not help. On the second day, she almost knocked on his door. She stood in the hallway outside apartment 4 for 30 seconds and then walked back to her own apartment, because she did not want to make it into something he needed to respond to. She had not given the money to create an obligation. She was not going to show up at his door and make him feel obligated on top of everything else. The second night was harder than the first. She did not sleep well. She thought about the $11.40 in her checking account and the electric bill due in 8 days and the way the buffer worked when there was no buffer and the fact that she was 3 weeks from her own rent date with almost nothing to show for it. She had known all of this going in. She had done the math. The math had not gotten more comfortable in the doing. On the third morning, she came down the stairs earlier than usual because she could not sleep past 5:30, and she went to the lobby for her mail. And she ran into Gerald Fisk in the hallway outside his unit, Gerald in his undershirt and his work pants, holding a cup of coffee, looking like a man who had been up for an hour already and had things on his mind. He mentioned, the way Gerald mentioned things, the way a man who lives alone talks to his tenants, conversationally and without much preamble, that apartment 4 had been taken care of, paid in full, that Dale Morrow had moved out overnight, left the keys in the mailbox, no notice needed since the account was settled. Gerald said it with the mild satisfaction of a man whose problem had been resolved, then walked back toward his unit. Patrice stood in the lobby for a moment. Paid in full, she thought, not the $2,400 she had pushed under the door. Paid in full, Gerald had said, which implied a larger number. Dale Morrow had been behind by more than what she had given him. The difference had come from somewhere. She did not know where. She stood with this information for a moment, looking at the row of mailboxes. Then she got her mail and went upstairs and got Gideon ready for school. She did not let herself feel a particular small hurt of the disappearance for the first 2 days. She understood it intellectually. A man who had been helped by a near stranger and chose to leave without a word was not necessarily a bad man. He might be a private one, a proud one, a man who could not face the version of himself implied by the exchange. She had done what she did without expectation of return. She believed that when she pushed the envelope under the door, and she still believed it a week later. But she was human, and the human thing inside her had given away its last soft object, and the man for whom it had been given was gone, and the necklace was sitting in a glass case on Galveston Avenue. The week after, on a Thursday evening, Gideon was at the kitchen table with his homework, and Patrice was making pasta on the stove, the particular easy pasta she made on weeknights when she was tired and creative effort felt like too much, just pasta with olive oil and garlic and some Parmesan as she had it, which she did. She was watching the water come to boil and thinking about whether she could ask Don at work to cover her Saturday shift so she could take the extra shift at the dry cleaner on Magnolia, where she had worked briefly 2 years ago, and where the manager had once told her she could come back for extra hours if she ever needed them. She was running numbers in a quiet back corner of her mind the way she always ran numbers, the continuous low-frequency calculation of a woman whose margin for error was small and who had made that margin smaller. She heard the knock at her door. She turned the burner to low and went to the door and opened it. He was standing in the hallway. But the man standing in the hallway of the Fenwick Arms outside Unit 6 on a Thursday evening in early October was not quite the man she had known as Dale Morrow, the man in the worn jacket with the beat-up Pontiac and the rolled-elbow simplicity of someone who did not spend much on clothes. The man in her doorway was wearing dark slacks and a white shirt, untucked, open at the collar, and a dark jacket that was plain in cut, but was made of something that was not available at the price point she was accustomed to seeing on men in this building. It was not flashy. It was not trying to announce anything. It was simply well made in a way that was specific and unmistakable once you had looked at enough clothing made by people who did not care about quality versus quality by people who did. His hair was the same. His face was the same. His eyes were the same. But the overall composition of him had shifted in a way that she could not have articulated quickly. She said his name as a question. She said, "Dale?" He said, "That is not actually my name." He said it quietly, not with apology, with the specific directness of a person who has decided to say something that needs to be said and has chosen not to cushion it. He said, "My name is Robert Callahan." She heard the name the way you hear a name that is familiar from a context entirely disconnected from the face in front of you. Robert Callahan. She had seen that name on a building. She had seen it in a headline. She was looking at him, and she was looking at the hallway behind him where, visible through the window at the end, parked at the curb below, was a car that was not the beat-up Pontiac. It was a dark green Porsche Cayenne that had no business being on Crestline Drive at all. Her hand tightened on the doorframe. "Robert Callahan," she said, and her voice had changed when she said it the second time because a connection had completed in her brain, and she was looking at a man who ran a company called Callahan Medical Supply and Distribution, which was based in Fort Worth, and which, she had read somewhere in the last few years, had revenues in excess of $400 million annually. She did not know the number precisely. She knew it was large. She knew it was a name on a building on Lancaster Avenue in the medical district, a name on a charitable foundation, a name her doctor had mentioned once in passing when she asked about a piece of equipment in the office, and the doctor had said, "Oh, that comes through Callahan." She said, "You had better come in." He sat at her kitchen table. She turned the burner back up because the water was still going, and she needed something to do with her hands, and she needed the ordinary logic of making pasta to run in the background the next few minutes while she reorganized everything she thought she knew about the past 4 months. He did not start with the company. He started with why he had been an apartment for in the first place, because he understood that was what she needed to understand first. He said his name without preamble, without performance, in the measured voice of a man who had decided on the drive over that he was going to say what needed to be said in the order it needed to be said, and not otherwise. He said his name was Robert James Callahan, and he was 44 years old, and he had run Callahan Medical Supply and Distribution, which his grandfather had founded in 1958 as a small surgical equipment distributor, and which now had 11 regional warehouses and approximately 2,000 employees and a distribution network that reached 43 states. He had run it since his father's health forced a transition in 2018. He had been running it without a break, without a vacation of any kind that lasted more than 3 days, without a moment of genuine remove from the company's daily demands. For 6 years. And approximately 8 months ago, something in him had broken down in a way that had initially presented as a problem with his work and had eventually been diagnosed by a doctor he trusted as burnout that had crossed over into something more clinical, something with a name that he was not embarrassed by, but that had required him to stop. Stopping, for a man in his position, meant delegating in ways he had never delegated before, pulling back from the board's daily dependence on his presence, installing an interim operational head to handle the day-to-day, while he took what his doctor called an extended leave and what he called to himself quietly, trying to remember what it felt like to be a person rather than a job title. He had not gone to a resort. He had not hired a life coach. He had sublet his house in Westover Hills, the house on Ridgely Drive it had lived in for 9 years, and that had, at some point in the last 2 years, stopped feeling like a home and started feeling like an extension of the office. He had put a few things in a bag and rented an apartment under a name that could not be found in a 30-second search, a name that was close enough to his own that he could remember it without thinking. Dale from his grandfather, Morrow from his mother's maiden name, and he had moved into apartment 4 at the Fenwick Arms because he had driven past it on a day when he was looking for somewhere that was neither the house on Ridgely Drive nor the Callahan Medical Headquarters on Lancaster Avenue, and it looked like a place where nobody would come looking for him. He said he had not intended to stay as long as he did. He had intended to stay 1 month, and he had stayed for, because something about the specific size and pace of that building had been what he needed in a way he could not have predicted and would not have chosen deliberately. Not the poverty of it, he said, and his voice shifted slightly when he said this, as if he had thought carefully about how to say it, and was not entirely satisfied with any version of how it came out. Not the smallness. He was not in the business of finding poverty charming or instructive. He had understood that he was living in a place where real people were managing real difficulty, and that his presence there was unusual, and he had tried to keep that fact from being anyone's problem besides his own. He had kept the rent payments coming out of a bank account he maintained separately from the primary accounts, an account that was funded adequately but not extravagantly, because he wanted the exercise of living on a real budget to feel real rather than theoretical. He had been doing that for 3 months. In the 4th month, he had made an error in the account's management, a practical error having to do with an automatic transfer that had not processed correctly, and had found himself with a gap in the account that he could not close within the window of Gerald Fisk's patience without routing money in from his primary accounts in a way that would show up on his records and that he was not ready for the people around him to see. He had been in the process of arranging it when the notice arrived. He had been 2 days away from having it resolved quietly when he came home and found a white envelope under his door. He stopped here for a moment. He said he had found the envelope within a minute of her knocking. He said he had sat on the floor of apartment 4 and counted the bills twice. He said he had known immediately where it had come from because he had seen her coming up the stairs that afternoon, and he knew the building well enough to understand that no one else in it was in any position to have sent that amount of money to a man they owed nothing. He had not knocked on her door that night. He said this directly, and he said why. He said he needed to know what she had given up to do it, because the amount of cash in that envelope was not consistent with what he knew about her circumstances. And before he did anything else, he needed to understand the full weight of what had happened. So he had made one call, which he had not made in 8 months, to a person at his company, and he had asked him to look quietly into the pawn shop records on Galveston Avenue. He was not proud of the privacy implications of that, he said, and he did not justify it. He said he learned what she had sold, and he learned what she had been paid, and he learned that the object she had sold had belonged to her mother. He sat at the kitchen table in apartment 6 of the Fenwick Arms, and he said, in the flat, careful voice of a man who was keeping his own emotions at a manageable distance for the purposes of getting through a sentence, that no one in his life had ever given him something that actually cost him anything. Not one person. Not in the years before the company when he was building it, and the cost of everything was visible. Not in the years after when the cost of everything was invisible because people assumed he had no needs that money could not address. He had been given things at every stage of his life. Expensive things, useful things, well-intentioned things. But the specific calculus of sacrifice, the act of giving something away that you genuinely need, that genuinely came from somewhere it could not be replaced, that was a thing he had not experienced from another person in his adult life. He said he had packed his bags that night. He had paid the full balance on the apartment, which included the 2 months Gerald Fisk had been carrying in the current month and a forward month for courtesy, and he had left the keys in the mailbox before sunrise, and he had gone back to the house on Ridgely Drive, and he had spent 3 days sitting with what had happened before he could think about it clearly enough to know what to do next. Then he had gone to Mercer's Pawn and Trade on Galveston Avenue, and he had talked to the man behind the counter, whose name was Earl, and he had described the necklace, and Earl had confirmed he had it and that it was still in the case. Robert Callahan had bought it back for a number that was considerably more than Earl had been required to accept and considerably less than Robert had been prepared to pay, and he had put it in the inside pocket of his jacket and driven to Crestline Drive. He reached into his jacket. He set the small velvet pouch on the kitchen table between them. Patrice looked at it. The pasta had been finished for several minutes and was sitting in the colander in the sink, and neither of them had moved toward it. Gideon had appeared in the kitchen doorway twice since the man from Apartment 4 had sat down, and both times Patrice had told him gently that she was having conversation, and both times he retreated back to the living room with the particular dignity of a 9-year-old who has been asked to be patient, and is being patient because he was asked. She picked up the pouch. She could feel the weight of the locket inside it immediately. The specific, unambiguous weight of it, the way you can recognize something yours through fabric without seeing it. She opened the drawstring and turned the pouch upside down over her palm, and the necklace slid out and coiled in her hand, the chain, the small oval locket, cool from being inside the jacket. Her hands did not shake exactly. They did a thing that was not quite shaking, a fine tremor at the edges, a vibration of controlled feeling. She set the locket flat on her palm and looked at it for a long time. She looked at the worn, smooth side where her own fingers had pressed against it for 2 decades. She looked at the clasp on the chain, the small spring ring clasp that had never failed once in 20 years, even though she had always expected it to. She closed her fingers around it. She did not say anything for a long time. He did not fill the silence. He waited in the silence the way a person waits when they understand that the silence belongs to someone else, and filling it would be a kind of theft. When she finally looked up at him, her face was not composure, and it was not breakdown. It was somewhere in the middle, the specific territory of someone who was feeling something very large and managing it with the particular competence of a woman who had learned a long time ago that falling apart fully was something she did not have a schedule for. She said, "You did not have to do that." He said, "I know that." She said, "I did not give you that money to get something back." He said, "I know that too." He said it was important to him that she understood that what he was returning was not payment. He said, if it felt like payment, he would not have done it. He said he had tried to think of a way to return it that felt like something other than a transaction, and could not find one, because the thing was hers. It had always been hers, and belonging is not a transaction. She held the necklace in her hand for a long time, and then she reached up and clasped it around her neck, her fingers working the small clasp with the long habit of 20 years. And it was done, and it was back, and it was cold against the skin of her throat in the specific way of something that has been gone and has come home, and she sat with that for a moment. Then she got up and served the pasta. He stayed for 2 hours. That was the whole of the first evening. Pasta at a small kitchen table with child who appeared from the living room after 20 minutes and regarded the visitor with the frank, evaluative gaze of a 9-year-old, the gaze that makes no social calculation at all, only a human one. Gideon asked him what kind of car that was in front of the building. Robert said it was a Porsche. Gideon asked what a Porsche cost. Patrice said that was not a polite question to ask. Robert said it was a fair question and answered it honestly, naming a number that Gideon absorbed with the complete equanimity of a child who has not yet learned to attach anxiety to large numbers. Gideon said, "That is a lot of money for a car." Robert said, "It is." Gideon said, "Our car is a Honda." Robert said, "Hondas are good cars." Gideon said, "It has 162,000 miles." Robert said, "That is a good Honda then." Gideon seemed satisfied with this exchange and ate the rest of his pasta. The conversation between the adults was careful in the way of conversations that are building something that neither party has yet named. He told her about the company, more of it than she had known, the scope of it, what it actually did in practical terms, the distribution network, the medical supply chain, the foundation work, the parts of it he had built himself versus what had been handed to him. He talked about it without pride and without apology, which was not the way wealthy people usually talk about money in her experience. which was admittedly not extensive. He talked about it the way a person talks about a thing they have a complicated relationship with, something large and important and exhausting that they cannot imagine being without and cannot always imagine being with. She told him about Sunbright. She told him about the Ironer and the rubber mat and the 230 degrees and Donna Rash and Seal Morales and the particular specific smell of commercial steam, which was not unpleasant once you were used to it, which was actually somewhat comforting on cold mornings. She told him about Gideon's notebook, the green-covered one, and some of the things Gideon had written in it that she had been shown. He laughed at the right moments. He asked about the right things. He was, she noticed, a good listener in the specific way of a person who is actually interested, not a person who is performing interest. He left at 9:30. He stood at the door and said he would like to see her again, plainly, without dressing it up, and she said she would think about it, which was not a refusal, and they both knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. He called 2 days later, not texted, called, which was an old-fashioned thing that she registered without commenting on and that she found, privately, she preferred. They met for coffee at a place called Avoca Coffee on White Settlement Road, a small crowded place with mismatched chairs and good light, and prices that were manageable, and they sat for 3 hours on a Saturday morning while Gideon was at his friend Marcus's house. And when Patrice drove home afterward, she sat in her Civic for a few minutes in the parking lot of Fenwick Arms before going in. She was not ready to call it anything. She was being careful. She had reasons to be careful. The most practical reason was Gideon, who was 9 years old and who had not had anyone significant in his life, who was not either a blood relative or a schoolteacher, and who was old enough to attach and young enough to be hurt by attachment that went wrong, and who, as she had already observed, had greeted Robert Callahan with the evaluative directness of a child who had opinions and no filter for them. She was not going to put her son in the path of something uncertain. That was not negotiable. The second reason was the money. The money was not a small thing to navigate. It was not a small thing to be the woman who had given a billionaire cash in an envelope and then sat at his kitchen table. Because no matter how clear the situation actually was, the optics of it were the kind that other people would draw their own conclusions from, and those conclusions would be the wrong ones. And she knew this because she had already drawn them on herself, lying awake at 3 a.m, asking herself whether any part of her continued interest in the man from apartment, for it was colored by what he had, and arriving, after an extended and unsatisfying internal audit, at something that felt like the truth, which was that the man she had liked in the hallway and the laundry room and at the mailboxes was not a different man now that she knew his name. He was the same man with a larger context, and the context was intimidating, but the man was not. The man was the man who had sat at her kitchen table and talked to her son about cars with the seriousness of someone who took the question seriously. She did not let this make her move faster. She let it make her move as carefully as she already intended to, and then a little more carefully still. He came back to Crestline Drive. He rented apartment 4 again, under his real name this time, Gerald Fisk receiving the application from Robert James Callahan and reading it and calling Patrice before he called the applicant back, which she had not expected. Gerald said, "Patrice, do you know who this man is?" She said yes. Gerald said, "Is he all right?" She thought about the question for a moment and then said, "Yes, Gerald, he is." Gerald called Robert back the next day and rented him the apartment. This was a detail that mattered. He came back to apartment 4. He did not invite her to the house on Ridgely Drive. Not right away, not for months. He came back to Crestline Drive, which was neither necessary nor cheap in the sense that opportunity cost is cheap, which was to say that a man who could afford any address in Fort Worth had chosen this one. She did not let herself make too much of this too quickly, but she noticed it. The months that followed were ordinary months in the way that the best months are ordinary, full of the unremarkable accumulation of time spent with someone who is becoming known to you not through revelations but through repetitions, through the way they take their coffee and the route they prefer to walk and the thing they say when something goes wrong. Robert Callahan drank his coffee black and took it in the morning in a paper cup from the place on the end of the block, the same way he had when she thought his name was Dale Morrow, which told her something. He walked to the end of the block with the coffee and stood there for 10 minutes before coming back in, regardless of weather, because he said the first 10 minutes of the day without a screen in his hand were the only ones that belonged entirely to him. She respected this. She did not interrupt it. He learned the rhythms of her life the same way she had learned his sideways in accumulation. He learned that she was not a person who asked for help, and that the way to offer it without making her uncomfortable was to not offer it as help, but as logistics. He learned that Gideon needed to be given reasons for things. Real reasons, not parental shorthand. And that when given real reasons, Gideon was the most reasonable person in the room. He learned that Patrice's one real extravagance, the thing she spent money on that she could not entirely justify on a practical basis, was good coffee, not the drive-through kind, the real kind, and that this was the right extravagance to have, and he agreed with it. And on Saturday mornings, he brought 2 coffees from Avoca when he came over, which cost more than she would have spent, and which she accepted without comment. She watched him with Gideon. She watched carefully, the way a mother watches, which is a kind of watching that does not announce itself, and does not give the watcher away, but misses nothing. She watched for performance, for the particular self-conscious warmth of an adult who is aware of being evaluated and is playing to it. She did not find it. What she found, over weeks and then months, was a man who was genuinely interested in a 9-year-old's questions, who answered them seriously, who remembered the answers Gideon had given him in previous conversations and referenced them in later ones, who sat on the floor of the living room on a Sunday afternoon and let Gideon explain the 2019 Texas Rangers lineup in full without once looking at his phone. She was watching for the money to appear in a way that changed the shape of things. She had told him, in their second or third conversation, that she was not going to let what had happened between them become a transaction, that she had given him the money because a person in need was in front of her, and she had the means, and that was all it was, and that she was not going to have that simplicity overwritten by what he had done in response, which was generous and was right, but was not an exchange. He had said he understood. She had watched to see if he understood in practice, as well as in the conversation. He did not offer to pay her rent. He did not suggest a better apartment. He did not, when her Civic needed the front brakes done, offer to take care of it. He helped her look up mechanics on Hemphill Street with good reviews and drove her and Gideon to get ice cream while the car was in the shop, which was company and transportation, and not money, and which was exactly right. She filed this away. She filed a great many things away during those months. And the overall shape of what she was filing was a picture of a man who understood, at a level that was not explained to him in detail, why certain kind of help were acceptable and certain kinds were not. She did not know how he understood this. She thought perhaps he had understood it before he moved into Apartment 4, that the whole point of Apartment 4 had been, in some way, to put himself in a position where money could not be the primary fact about him, and that in doing so, he had learned something about what it felt like to be a person for whom that had always been the case. The moment she recognized her own feelings for what they were did not come from a conversation, or a revelation, or a grand evening anywhere with his name on the building. It came on a Tuesday morning in February. She was getting Gideon's school bag ready on the kitchen table, and she was running slightly late because Gideon had not been able to find one of his shoes, which had turned out to be behind the toilet for reasons neither of them could explain, and she was cramming the lunch bag into the school bag and zipping it with some force. And she heard the knock at her door, and it was Robert, holding 2 coffees, who looked at her face and said, "I can take him." She had said nothing, had not asked, and he said, "I can walk him. I am going that direction anyway." She had looked at him for a beat. She handed him the school bag. She watched them go down the hall together, Gideon talking immediately, already asking something, and Robert's voice answering, patient and unhurried, fading down the stairwell. She stood in her kitchen, and the feeling she had was something she did not let herself name until it was on her for a solid 30 seconds. Then she sat down with her coffee. She had been waiting. She understood, for something about him to feel wrong. For 4 months she had been waiting for the version of this that made sense on the outside, the version where a wealthy man's attention toward a woman who had done him an accidental favor resolved itself into something that explained away the quality of the attention, something she could point to and say, "Ah, there it is, that is why." She had been waiting for the other shoe to land. The shoe had not landed. What had landed, instead, over the course of 4 months, was something much quieter and more permanent. It was the fact that she had stopped thinking of him as the man from Apartment 4, the man with the company, the man whose name was on a building on Lancaster Avenue. She was thinking of him as Robert. She was thinking of him as the person she wanted to tell things to at the end of the day. She was thinking of him as someone whose absence from a specific Tuesday morning had made the morning feel smaller. She was in love with him. She understood. She was in love with him in the plain and practical way of a woman who had been careful about everything and had watched him for 4 months and could not find a reason not to be, which was a more solid foundation for feeling than most of the other ways she had heard people describe arriving at it. The moment he knew was different. He told her later that it had been earlier, which she had not expected. He said it had happened sometime in November, at the kitchen table, on an evening when Gideon had been describing the green notebook at length, and she had been listening with her chin in her hand and her eyes on her son, not aware of being observed, not performing anything for anyone, just a woman listening to her child with complete and unself-conscious attention. And he had looked at her face and understood something about what he was doing in apartment 4 on Crestline Drive that had nothing to do with anything he had told himself when he moved in. He said he had sat on it for months because he had not wanted to be wrong, and because he was aware of the specific difficulty of what the imbalance between their circumstances presented, not just for him but for her, particularly for her, who had given away her last object of value, without knowing who he was, and who deserved to be certain, fully certain, that nothing about the story she did not know had altered what was happening between them. He had wanted to give her enough time with the real version of him, enough ordinary time, enough specific repeated ordinary time, before he said what he wanted to say. He said it on a Saturday evening in March, not dramatically, not with preparation that announced itself. They were walking back along Crestline Drive from the corner where they had taken Gideon for ice cream, Gideon running ahead because he had spotted a dog outside the building that he wanted to investigate, and Robert had said, while they were walking and not looking directly at each other, that he wanted to tell her something. And she had said she was listening, and he had told her. She did not say it back immediately. She had never said anything before it was ready, and she was not going to start now. She walked another half block in silence, and he let her walk it, and then she said it back. And the weight in both of their voices when those words sat in the air between them was the weight of two people who had arrived somewhere by a very careful road, and were not going to treat the arrival as a small thing just because the saying of it was quiet. They stood in front of the Fenwick Arms on Crestline Drive, and Gideon was kneeling on the sidewalk introducing himself to a large brown dog of uncertain origin whose owner was an elderly man who seemed delighted by the conversation. And above them the evening was thinning into the pale gray that comes before dark, and that was a moment, unremarkable to everyone else and complete to them, where the story settled into its final shape. It took time after that. That is the accurate version of it. It took time, because time was what it deserved. Patrice did not rush toward the life that was available to her on the far side of Robert Callahan's full circumstances. She did not make decisions out of relief or gratitude or particular fatigue of years of tightness. Every decision she made the way she had always made decisions, by sitting with the numbers, except the numbers were different now, and the numbers were not money. The numbers were Gideon's specific schedule and Gideon's specific friendships on Crestline Drive, and the specific relationships Patrice had built at Sunbright over 6 years, relationships that were real and that mattered to her, and the question of whether and how those could be preserved through whatever came next. She did not quit Sunbright quickly. She told him this plainly and early. She was not going to walk away from a job that had supported her and her son for 6 years because her circumstances had changed. She was going to leave when she was ready and not before. He said he understood. She watched to see if he understood in practice, and he did, because he did not mention again and did not create situations in which her continuing to work early shifts at a commercial laundry was inconvenient or embarrassing. She left Sunbright 8 months later, which was when she was ready, which was also when she had found a part-time position doing scheduling and coordination at a pediatric clinic on 8th Avenue that paid less per hour, but asked her to sit down while she worked and gave her the afternoons. They moved to the house on Ridgely Drive in stages. That is the precise way to describe it. Not a single dramatic change of address, but a gradual shifting of center of gravity. Gideon's things appearing in the room that became his room. Then Patrice's things. Then the kitchen being reorganized in the way of a kitchen that has a specific person's cooking logic applied to it. The Fenwick Arms apartment remained on the lease for 3 months after they stopped regularly sleeping there, which was her choice and which he did not question, because she had needed to know it was still there while she adjusted. She paid the 3 months out of her own salary, and he did not offer to take it over. The house on Ridgely Drive was a wide single-story house on a shaded street in Westover Hills, a quiet neighborhood of old trees, and established lawns and houses that had been there long enough to have personalities. The house had 4 bedrooms and a kitchen that Patrice fell in love with on the first tour of it. A kitchen with a window above the sink that looked out onto the backyard and good light all morning. It had a study for Robert that faced east. It had a room for Gideon that he immediately designated a base of operations, and into which he moved his desk and his Texas Rangers posters and the green notebook in his position of honor on the bookshelf above the desk. The wedding was on a Saturday in early May on the back patio of that house on Ridgely Drive, under the oak trees, in the particular light of a late Texas spring morning that is warm enough for short sleeves and cool enough for comfort. She could have had the ballroom at any number of Fort Worth venues that Robert's name and company would have opened for a phone call. She had the backyard. This was her choice, made simply and not loudly, without it being a statement for anyone's benefit, because what she wanted was a back patio and good weather and the people who mattered, not a venue that said something. The people who mattered were not many. Her sister Becca and Becca's husband drove in from Amarillo. Donna Rash and Seal Morales from Sunbright drove from the east side with their husbands, and Donna cried, which nobody was surprised by, because Donna cried at everything and made no apology for it, which was one of the things Patrice had always liked about her. Gerald Fisk came, which surprised her and which, when she thought about it, made complete sense, because Gerald Fisk was, on the bark, exactly the kind of man who showed up for his tenants when it counted. He wore a suit that fit him adequately, and he brought a car with $20 inside it, and he pressed it into Patrice's hand and said, "I'm glad for you," and she knew he meant it. Robert's operational head at Callahan Medical, a man named Tom Brower, was there, and a few other people from Robert's side who were quiet and warm and did not make the day about the company. Gideon was the one who found the dog. This was not planned. 3 weeks before the wedding, Gideon had come home from school with a brochure from the Tarrant County Animal Shelter and a presentation he had apparently prepared in his head, if not on paper, and which he delivered at the dinner table with the comprehensive confidence of a child who has already made up his mind and is consulting the adults out of courtesy. He wanted a dog. He had researched the dogs available at the shelter. He had identified a specific dog, a 4-year-old brown mixed breed of uncertain origin, who was listed as gentle and house-trained, and who had been at the shelter for 2 months, which Gideon said would particularly weigh a child who has absorbed the implications of that number. The dog came home a week before the wedding. Gideon named him Crockett, which Patrice thought was going to be after school, and which turned out to be after Davy Crockett, whom Gideon had recently developed a strong interest into the Green Notebook, and which Robert had said was an excellent name, and which Crockett the dog appeared to accept without objection. On the day of the wedding, Crockett sat beside Gideon on the patio with the specific settled calm of a dog who has found his place and is not going anywhere, and Gideon's hand rested on Crockett's back with the same quality, the same settled certainty. And Patrice looked at her son's face during the brief ceremony and understood something about the last year and a half that she had not had language for before that moment. Gideon looked like a child who had stopped holding his breath. She wore the necklace, the thin chain at her throat, the small oval locket with the worn smooth side turned against her skin. The dress was ivory, not elaborate. A simple dress she had found in a shop on West 7th Street, and which she had paid for herself because she was not going to be dressed by anyone else's money on her own wedding day. She looked like herself, which was exactly what she intended. She looked like a woman on a bright Saturday morning in a backyard under oak trees, finally exhaling, finally in the specific possession of an ordinary contentment that she had not known she was working toward until she was in the middle of it. Robert stood across from her in the shade and looked at her the way a person looks at someone they have chosen with full information, chosen after watching carefully, chosen because the watching had produced no reason not to and 100 reasons to. He did not look like a man who had won something. He looked like a man who had arrived somewhere, which is a different thing and a better one. After the ceremony, in the afternoon, while Donna Rash was helping the kitchen, and Becca's kids were running the yard, and Gerald Fisk was having a serious conversation with Seal Morales' husband about the Astros' pitching rotation, Patrice stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard, where Gideon was sitting under the big oak tree with Crockett's head in his lap, the green notebook open on his knee, writing something down, and Robert came up beside her with a glass of lemonade and handed it to her without a word, and she accepted it without a word, and they stood there together at the window and watched the yard. That was the whole of it. That was what it looked like from the inside on the day it was finished. An ordinary kitchen window on an ordinary spring afternoon, a boy and his dog under a tree, a man standing beside the woman he had married, and a glass of lemonade, cold and simple and exactly right. People in that building on Crestline Drive, and people who heard the story afterward, which they did because stories like this one travel. Told it the way people tell the version that makes the most sense from the outside. They told it as the story of a woman who happened to be kind to the right stranger at the right time and had her luck turn. The lucky woman, the smart woman, the woman who made the right call without knowing it was the right call. Some people said it was fate. Some people said she had always seemed like the kind of person good things should happen to, which is a thing people say about someone when they've come through something and they want to make sense of why. They lined up her goodness and his wealth like two things pointing at each other and called the line between them a story with a moral. She had heard all of these versions. She understood why people needed them. The fairy tale version of what happened on Crestline Drive was tidier than the real one, and tidiness is what most people want from a story, if they're being honest. The real story is this. She did not know who he was. She stood in her kitchen at 2 a.m. and thought about a man going somewhere without a roof, and she went to a pawn shop, and she sold the last soft thing she had left, and she pushed the money under the door of a near stranger because she could not make the alternative sit right in her chest. She did not know the car parked at the curb would turn out to be a Porsche Cayenne. She did not know the name on the apartment. Lease would turn out to be on a building on Lancaster Avenue. She did not know any of it, not one word of it, and it would not have changed what she did if she had. Because a man going without a roof is a man going without a roof, and the math of that does not change based on what he owns in another life. She did not give that necklace away to get anything back. And in the end, she got everything back anyway. She still notices. That is the last true thing about Patrice Hollen, and she will tell it plainly. She still notices a specific quality of quiet in a person who is managing something they have not said out loud yet. She still notices when something is wrong in a particular way that something is wrong when a person is running thin, not just financially, but in the deeper sense, in the sense of having used up the available reserves of keeping it together. She notices it at the pediatric clinic on 8th Avenue, and she noticed in a woman at the grocery store 2 weeks ago who was standing in the aisle with a cart and a list and the face of someone doing arithmetic in their head. She is not able to turn this off, and she does not want to. She stopped needing the money a long time ago. She did not stop needing to use the thing she is good at, which is seeing people, and it turns out that seeing people does not require being in need yourself. It just requires having been in need long enough to know what it looks like from the inside. She would do it again. That is the accurate answer to the question anyone might reasonably ask at the end of the story, which is whether, knowing everything she now knows about what was waiting on the other side of that decision, she would make the same choice. She would do it again for a man she would never know was wealthy. She would do it again for a man who turned out to have nothing. She would do it again because the man in front of her was going without a roof, and she had the means to prevent it, and whether or not the means cost her something she could not replace was not the deciding factor. The deciding factor was always going to be the same one. She could not make the alternative sit right in her chest. That has never changed. Now come back here for a moment. A whole building full of people walked past the man in apartment 4 for 4 months and never looked at him twice. They had no reason to. He looked like the rest of them. He was quiet. He kept to himself. He took up exactly as little space as he had chosen to take up, and there was nothing about him that asked to be noticed. One woman who had almost nothing left gave him the only thing she had, with no expectation of return, because the arithmetic of his need was greater than the arithmetic of her loss, and she did not know how to live with herself if she did the other math instead. Have you ever given something away that you genuinely could not afford to give? Not money necessarily, though money counts. Time, energy, the thing that mattered to you, the specific soft thing you've been holding on to because it was yours and because there was comfort in it. Have you ever given that to someone who needed it more, with no way of knowing if it would ever find its way back to you? Have you ever stood at the counter and said yes before the number was finished, because the math was already done and it had already come out the same way every time you ran it? Tell me about it in the comments. Every single comment gets read. She would genuinely love to know. And if this story got to you tonight, if you believe the way she has come to believe it, right down to the ground, that the realest thing one person can do for another is see them clearly and give them what they need without running the calculation of what comes back. Then do one small thing. Hit that subscribe button if you have not yet. Drop a like so the next person finds their way here too. Leave your story in the comments and she will be there. She will see you in the very next one. Trust her, it is a good one.